Andrew Radkitch, better known as Atun-Shei Films, has been a man I've been focusing my criticisms against for nearly 2 years. I've gone through the entirety of his Checkmate Lincolnite series in meticulous detail, noting the many problems with it and how it has negatively impacted discourse on the American Civil War. When I stuck my toes into the mire of this series, I thought it would be a simple case of discounting his arguments. But little did I know how egregious his content would be. From telling bold-faced lies to outright murdering the opposition, Andrew's content has been a whirlwind of madness, hatred, and pride, made all the worse by those who actively defend him and his content as educational. It is these actions, these sins, for the lack of a better term, that morph his content from being merely misleading to downright insidious in its nature. I wish to cover a sliver of these sins, a singular video to demonstrate why his content is bad, what warrants it being labeled as a sin, and how these sins are propagated to poison the well of discourse. We'll first start with the mundane aspects, the predictable particularities that I expected when entering this series. His lies. As with all general historical discourse, it is expected that falsehoods and misinformation will be spread, either wittingly or not. For instance, I've made several errors in my videos in the past, though all were minor errors and I only realized them after the fact. In those cases, I usually made a statement in the comments section with the correct information and explaining why I made the error. Those are to be expected. Andrew, however, has told numerous bold-faced lies throughout his Checkmate Lincolnite series. Some range from simple errors akin to what I'd make, but others are far more egregious in nature. For instance, on several occasions, he made a number of bold statements regarding Robert E. Lee's support of slavery. Most notably, he made the following statement in the final episode of Checkmate Lincolnites.
That seems to me like an argument ultimately stemming from states' rights. I would argue that it's more of a reflection of the Southern rights nationalism we talked about in episode 8, but yeah, Virginia was on the whole much more moderate. There you had lots of influential pro-slavery unionists like your boy Bobby Lee, who in 1860 believed that preserving slavery from outside interference was absolutely essential, but decried the Deep South's actions as illegal and revolutionary.
His claim that Lee was a pro-slavery unionist is demonstrably false. Lee was adamant about his disdain for the institution, which is recorded in his most oft-quoted letter from 1856 to his wife, a private correspondence where he made it explicitly clear that he did not have any love for the institution. However, the letter has been perverted by some particularly disingenuous historians, and by Andrew, by saying his unwillingness to support the abolitionist movement and his belief that slavery would end by divine providence connotates a support of the institution. This is a false dilemma. The argument stems from making a disdain for slavery synonymous with supporting the abolitionist movement in the United States. Their argument can be summarized as this. If you support the end of the institution, you must support the abolitionist movement. This is a classical example of a false dilemma fallacy, wherein a person either must support a movement or they do not support the agenda of said movement. In truth, a person can still support a piece of agenda a given movement advocates for, yet not agree with the means by which they seek to achieve their end goal. In the case of Robert E. Lee, he was adamant that slavery was an evil, but believed the best course of action would be its gradual end. The abolitionists, by contrast, believed slavery was evil, but wanted immediate abolition, ignoring any of the possible consequences of such a course of action. It was this disconnect and the horrible actions taken by abolitionists like John Brown that drove men, such as Lee, away from their moral cause. Ultimately, Lee was anti-slavery, but held a view more akin to Thomas Jefferson, George Wythe, and George Mason. the belief that slavery would be ended gradually, in a fashion and form that would be best for all parties involved, otherwise known as divine providence. Yet, Andrew insists that Lee was pro-slavery. This lie is one of the most blatant lies told in the series. Yet it isn't the only type of lie. A common lie rendered by Andrew is his lies through omission. An example that best exhibits a lie through omission is the presentation of the following Alexander Stephens quote.
And as former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens argued in 1868,
the conflict on this question of slavery was not a contest between the advocates or opponents of that peculiar institution.
When I was researching this quotation for episode 9 of Checkmate Atun-Shei, I initially had a difficult time discerning where it was, as the citation Atun-Shei provided was not correct. It placed the quotation in one of the appendices, but the quotation in question appeared in the introduction interview of Stephens's book, A Constitutional View of the Late War Between the States, Its Causes, Character, Conduct, and Results. In it, the full statement, which appears on page 18, reads as follows. The conflict on this question of slavery in the federal councils, from the beginning, was not a contest between the advocates or opponents of that peculiar institution, but a contest, as stated before, between the supporters of a strictly federal government on the one side and a thoroughly national one on the other. As you can see here, the removal of "in the federal councils" is an omission of detail, which alters the meaning of the statement entirely. Without it, you are left with the impression that he's referring to this being the belief on the whole, when, in reality, he is referring to a specific place within the federal government where this statement was true. This is not a statement that is denying slavery as an issue, but a statement clarifying its position within the context of the federal government, between the various senators and congressmen who made up the legislative body. This bit of context is necessary to understand what Stephens is referring to. With it removed, it alters the meaning of the statement to the benefit of Andrew's argument. This lie through omission is a commonplace tactic in his later videos, especially in the final episode. In that one, he consistently removes statements discussing the matter from a constitutional basis to focus wholly on slavery and nothing but slavery. In some cases, he outright doctors together entire quotations by combining sentences from entirely different parts of the document together into a general statement. This being best exhibited in his quotation of Mississippi's secession document. It is through these lies that Andrew is able to manipulate his audience, most of whom are not privy to the documents being covered, into believing his presentation of them. Lying of this nature is bad, if not outright dangerous, because they are manipulative. Such manipulative lies are what leads men astray, causing them to stumble and fall. Though the degree and magnitude of these lies is surprising, the fact they occurred is not. What is more troubling is what these are a response to, a key part of the format of this series. To an extent, I can understand how someone can get the information wrong, or may lose sight of the forest through the trees. Yet, what differentiates Andrew's content as distinctly detrimental is the format in which he expresses his flawed worldview. Checkmate Lincolnites, as a series, is built upon a fallacious form of argumentation. Its foundations lay upon one specific fallacy, a fallacy that even great men of the past had difficulty avoiding: the humble yet enduring straw man. For those who may be unaware, or may attempt to dispute this fact, I believe it's important we understand what is a straw man, how Andrew uses this fallacy, and his intention behind using it. A straw man, in the simplest of terms, is an informal argument of refuting an argument that is different from the one being discussed, while failing to acknowledge the distinction in the argument. This can take various forms, including, but not limited to, misquoting the person in question, thus stripping it of its original context, oversimplifying the opponent's argument, pursuing someone who has a poor position in the debate as the defender of said position, and exaggerating the opponent's argument. All of this might sound oddly familiar, as Andrew, in every single episode of the series, utilizes every single form of these tactics. The straw man is represented best with one singular character, if it can even be called such, Johnny Reb. Originally, the format of the series was built upon taking comments out of context and putting them in an avatar in the form of Johnny Reb. Johnny Reb is, for all intents and purposes, a caricature of what Andrew perceives his opponents as. Pro-Southern hicks who have no idea what they're discussing, often portraying him as dim-witted and borderline schizophrenic. To say that he is an unflattering depiction of his opponents is an understatement. He is designed to be insulting to those who question his content. It's through this caricature that Andrew presents the comments he wishes to discuss, most of which are bottom-of-the-barrel comments that poorly represent the overall position. It is here that the straw man is constructed, by choosing comments that lack any details on the position being taken, poorly explain the position, or simply add nothing to the discussion. Andrew can control the argument and construct for his audience the opposition's position. In addition, by stripping them from their original context and presenting them in a new format in which they unknowingly cannot respond to until days, weeks, or months after the video is published, Andrew can unfairly represent their position and beliefs without the person in question having the chance to respond. All of this serves a purpose. It enables for Andrew to control the argument and make himself look more competent and intelligent than he actually is. In the same stroke, it makes his critics look unintelligent, if not downright ignorant, when in truth they cannot retort in the first place. For the audience, it presents the worst possible image of the opposition and convinces them that Andrew must be correct, even though the opposition in question is nothing more than Andrew playing a caricature of how he perceives his opponents. The method by which Andrew has pursued to present his argument is what discredits any legitimacy for his arguments. Even if we presume what he said was correct, the usage of the straw man strips any legitimacy from the statements because the method in which they were presented is done in bad faith. For instance, Galileo Galilei attempted to present the heliocentric model of the solar system through this method. In Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Galileo commits the strawman fallacy by portraying the geocentric position in a negative fashion through the character of Simplicio, who, as the name suggests, was a simple-minded man whom Salviati was able to easily dismiss. The slanderous nature of the book, and not his position on heliocentrism, is what ultimately led to his arrest and trial by the Catholic Church, resulting in him being sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. In short, the method in which one pursues their argument is as important as the argument presented. Andrew Ridley commits one of the most grievous fallacies throughout Checkmate Lincolnites for the purpose of bolstering his argument. Ultimately, it diminishes anything he has to say, as, in the act of committing such an informal fallacy, it strips him of all legitimacy. He becomes a bad faith actor willing to be right, regardless of what he does in the process. It is here that we move away from his arguments and cover the more troubling aspects of his character. Andrew is not merely a fallacious debater, but someone who has deeply troubling behaviors that shouldn't be ignored. The prior two problems define Andrew as, at a minimum, a disingenuous party in the debate. Yet, the problems with them aren't limited to his arguments and their presentation. They extend to his behavior towards those things he inherently dislikes. The most blatant example of this is seen in episode 2 of Checkmate Lincolnites, where he has to say the following.
Look, I know it's hard to hear that your great-grandpappy was all in for slave labor. It's a bummer, even taking into account his reasons for believing that, and to him, they were good reasons. You don't want to think of him that way. You want to think of him as this heroic defender of hearth and home, not as an enthusiastic foot soldier in the slaver's army. But the truth is, he was both. He was a complicated, flawed human being, just like you or me. Now all the great-grandpappies are in the ground, and they've been moldering there for more than 100 years. If you could go back in time and meet them, their beliefs would have horrified you. These long-dead racists are not your friends. You have nothing in common with them. What they stood for was evil, and everybody seems to know it, but you. And until you guys reconcile that fact, you really shouldn't be surprised that you're being criticized.
The clip makes manifest his views on these historical figures. He holds them in contempt. This is made all the more manifest in his video on Confederate monuments, where he flips off the monuments in question. Behavior of this nature can only be understood as overt malice towards those people. People, I might add, Andrew never knew on any personal level. The reason why I take issue with this can be made abundantly clear with a precursory look of the content on my channel. I often cover and talk about these men, often individual soldiers who fought for the Confederacy and died during the war. I treat them as people, human beings, who were loved, cherished, and often died far too young. To me, understanding these men as men brings us closer to understanding our mortality, our legacy, and our inevitable fate, while in turn humanizing them. What we ought to do is return the flesh and blood to the bones of these men, if but for a moment, and see them as they are, people, regardless of their past deeds. Even when discussing murderers, such as Henry Clay Beatty, I do not show a shred of disrespect. It isn't in my power to render judgment. That is for God to render. To see Andrew show such disrespect, such deep-rooted contempt, it transforms him from merely a man arguing in bad faith to someone with deeply malicious intentions, a man caught up in his hatred to not see how he is no better. Yet, before I bore witness to his defamation of the dead, before I bore witness to the bad faith arguments, what convinced me of Andrew's evil intentions was this one singular scene from the very first episode of this series.
Hey, can I see your gun? Oh, certainly. Cool, thanks. Nice.
It was this scene that convinced me that there was something profoundly wrong with Andrew, that something had gone terribly wrong at some point in his life. Many have insisted that this is purely a stunt, an act. Yet I'm not convinced by such appeals. This was early, exceedingly early, in the series. Andrew is not playing a character when he wields the pistol. This is meant to be himself. The character is his caricature, who, at this point, had no trappings of a character to speak of. When I look at this, I don't see acting. I see a statement of intent. Andrew does not merely think his opposition is wrong. He actively seeks to destroy them, to render them naught by committing the sin of Cain. As the story from Genesis goes, Cain was envious of his brother, Abel, for God had favored his sacrifices over Cain's. Instead of appealing to God for an answer, to find some way to better serve him, Cain decided to enact vengeance against his brother. Driven by envy and wrath, Cain murdered his brother. In a similar vein, Andrew cannot argue against his opposition. He is envious of his opponents because he cannot one-up them. When they contradict his narrative, often stating the facts as they are, it fills him with rage, made more apparent when the opposition does not hold his particular political leanings. As a result, this became manifest in the very first episode of this series with the brutal, grotesque murder of his straw man, the embodiment of the opposition he despises. Most troubling of all, I doubt he has not once considered the implications of his bad deeds. If anything, he may find them pleasurable. A cathartic thing brought about by the sinful deed. It would be unsurprising to me. If we look at his Twitter profile, we only need to see who has promoted his movies and his willingness to accept their promotion to understand why I say these things. After having bore witness to this series, having seen all that Andrew has to offer, I can only say this about Andrew. God save him. Andrew's content has left me deeply troubled, not only for him, but for those who indulge in his content. There is something profoundly wrong with him, something I can only describe as twisted, malformed, and corrupt. What's more disturbing is how these videos have gained as much traction as they have, how they have become the zeitgeist of the age, how people turn to them as a source, even though they are flawed in both premise and execution. No YouTuber has had such a negative impact on the discussion of the American Civil War as Andrew. One day, his works, it is hoped, will be undone. But until that time, it will be a long road, a straight and narrow path towards recovery and rehabilitation of a healthy discussion of the war. I pray God will bring reason back to those disillusioned by Andrew's works, to come to learn the errors of their ways and seek a greater depth and knowledge. Finally, before I part, I wish to say this to all who've weathered this series with me. May God bless all of you.